One courageous act of heroism can turn a moment of desperation into a powerful wave of change. Watch as a young boy's bravery shatters hatred and alters destinies forever. Jamal walked through the cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood, his hands tucked into the pockets of his faded jacket. The weight of the day sat heavy on his small shoulders, though he had long learned to push past it. Life in his part of the city wasn't easy, but he carried himself with quiet resilience. He had no choice. His sneakers, barely holding together, scraped against the pavement as he made his way toward the outskirts of the neighborhood. The sun had begun to set, casting an orange glow over the buildings ahead. He had no destination in mind, just another evening, trying to escape the four crumbling walls of the tiny apartment he shared with his grandmother. As he neared the edge of the district, a strange glow filled the air. It wasn't the fading sun. It was something unnatural, something alive. A thick column of smoke curled toward the sky, black and ominous. People on the streets began to turn their heads, murmurs filling the air. Sirens blared in the distance. Jamal's eyes followed the smoke until they landed on a massive building, one of the most exclusive establishments in the city. It was the kind of place that made it clear people like him weren't welcome. Owned by one of the wealthiest and most openly racist men in town, the club was known for its extravagant events, closed doors, and an unspoken rule about who belonged inside. But tonight, the club was in chaos. Flames licked at its grand walls, swallowing them inch by inch. The air carried the acrid scent of burning wood, metal, and something else, something more human. Then, over the roar of the fire, came the sound of screams. Jamal froze. The cries were sharp and desperate. Someone was still inside. A crowd had gathered at a safe distance, watching as the inferno consumed the building. People murmured among themselves, but no one moved. Firefighters had yet to arrive, and fear kept everyone rooted in place. Then came the chilling realization. "The kids are still in there," a woman's voice shrieked. Jamal turned his head sharply. "Kids." His heart pounded as the weight of the words sank in. The millionaire's twin children, barely younger than him, were trapped inside. He had seen them before, from a distance, always in clean, expensive clothes, always looking at him and kids like him with something between curiosity and disdain. They had lived in a different world, one he had no place in. But in this moment, none of that mattered. Jamal's legs moved before his brain could catch up. Without thinking, he pushed forward, weaving through the stunned crowd. People gasped as he sprinted toward the burning building, his small figure cutting through the thickening smoke. The heat slammed into him as he neared the front steps. The fire snarled and hissed, warning him to stay back, but he didn't. He couldn't. Somewhere inside, those kids were still screaming. And Jamal wasn't the kind of person to leave anyone behind. Jamal had always known struggle. It was written into the fabric of his life, woven through the dimly lit apartment he shared with his grandmother, in the meals that were sometimes too small, and in the way people looked at him when he walked through certain parts of town. He had learned to tune out the judgment, to hold his head high despite the whispers, the suspicious stares, and the feeling that the world had already decided who he was before he could prove otherwise. He was a fighter, not in the way people assumed. He didn't throw punches, didn't start trouble, but he fought for his place, for his dignity. He fought against the idea that just because he came from a struggling neighborhood, he was destined for failure. His grandmother had always told him, "You don't let the world tell you who you are, Jamal. You show them." And he believed that. That's why, when he heard the screams from inside the burning building, he didn't hesitate. Because Jamal knew what it meant to be overlooked, to feel like no one was coming to save you. And no matter who those kids were, they didn't deserve to be left behind. The burning building belonged to a man who had never spared a thought for kids like Jamal. Mr. Whitaker was the kind of man whose name carried weight in the city, powerful, influential, and deeply set in his ways. His wealth had bought him respect in the circles that valued money above all else, but it had also insulated him from the realities of those outside his world. For years, he had made it clear that people like Jamal had no place near his establishments. His club, a grand structure built on wealth and exclusivity, had been a monument to that belief. It was a place for the elite, a gathering spot for those who shared his values, those who looked like him, thought like him. To Jamal and his community, the club wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of everything they were shut out from. They had grown up knowing its doors would never open for them, that its owner saw them as nothing more than a nuisance, an inconvenience. But now, the mighty walls of Mr. Whitaker's empire were crumbling, quite literally. Flames were swallowing the very thing he had built to separate himself from those he deemed unworthy. And inside, his own children, the heirs to his fortune, were trapped, crying for help. Mr. Whitaker's prejudices weren't just personal, they were generational. His family had built wealth on the backs of those they had kept down. His club had existed for decades as a private space for men like him, passed down through his family as a place where the powerful could gather, untouched by the struggles of the real world. He had spent years ensuring that people like Jamal knew their place, refusing business from anyone he felt didn't fit his standards. And while he had never openly voiced his racism, his actions spoke volumes. The people who worked for him knew where he stood. The city knew. But fire didn't care about wealth or power. It didn't care that Mr. Whitaker was a man who had spent his life building barriers. It only cared about consuming everything in its path. And now, as flames licked at the grand entrance of his exclusive club, his legacy was no longer in his hands. It rested in the hands of a 10-year-old boy who had every reason to walk away, but chose not to. Jamal may not have had money, privilege, or a name that carried weight, but what he did have was courage. And tonight, that courage would be the only thing standing between life and death. The fire roared like a living beast, consuming everything in its path. Thick, black smoke billowed into the night sky, turning the once pristine building into a burning inferno. People gathered on the streets, some shouting for help, others frozen in horror. Firefighters were still minutes away, but the heat was suffocating, and the structure groaned under the weight of the flames. Jamal stood in the crowd, his heart pounding. He could hear the desperate screams piercing through the crackling fire, two voices, high-pitched and terrified. The twins, they were still inside. He didn't think. He didn't stop to weigh the risks. He just ran. Jamal's decision to act. His sneakers barely had traction on the pavement as he sprinted toward the burning building. The crowd gasped, some yelling for him to stop, but he didn't listen. His mind was fixed on one thing. Those children needed help, and no one else was going in. Smoke stung his eyes the moment he stepped inside. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with the scent of burning wood and fabric. His lungs burned with every breath, but he pushed forward, squinting through the haze. He had no plan, no clear path, just instinct and determination. He coughed violently but pressed on. The fire licked at the walls, casting flickering shadows that made everything seem unreal. But the cries of the babies, high-pitched and desperate, kept him moving. Jamal followed the sound, his heart racing. He found the twins huddled in the corner of what used to be an elegant lounge, their small bodies curled up, trembling in fear. The fire was creeping closer, dancing across the wooden floor, inching toward them. He didn't hesitate. He scooped them up, one in each arm, holding them close to his chest. Their tiny hands gripped his shirt, their cries muffled against his body. "Hold on," he whispered, even though they were too young to understand. The flames had spread fast, faster than he had expected. His exit route was nearly blocked, the hallway he had come through now swallowed in flames. He looked around, his mind racing for another way out. Then, through the smoke, he saw it. A window. His muscles burned as he ran toward it, his lungs screaming for air. The heat made his skin feel like it was peeling, but he refused to slow down. He shielded the babies as best as he could, and, with every ounce of strength he had, kicked the glass with his foot. It shattered instantly. The fresh air hit him like a wave, but there was no time to celebrate. He climbed onto the ledge, the wind whipping at his face, and carefully, one by one, lowered the babies down to the waiting arms of the bystanders below. Then, just as he was about to jump, the floor behind him gave way. Jamal felt the heat surge as the flames closed in, and for a split second, he thought he might not make it. But then, with a deep breath and one final push, he leapt through the window, crashing onto the pavement below. The world spun around him. The noise of sirens, the shouts of people, the cries of relief, it all blended into a dizzying haze. His arms and legs throbbed, his lungs ached, but as he lifted his head he saw them. The babies. They were safe. The crowd erupted into cheers, people clapping and shouting his name. Some rushed forward, helping him to his feet, patting him on the back. But Jamal barely heard any of it. His eyes locked onto the man standing just beyond the crowd, Mr. Whitaker. The millionaire's face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the boy who had just saved his children. Jamal didn't know what would happen next. He didn't care. He hadn't done it for praise or for approval. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. And now, standing there, covered in soot and sweat, he had proven something, not just to Mr. Whitaker, but to the entire world. Compassion knew no bounds. Have you ever had to make a split-second decision to help someone in need? What would you do if you were in Jamal's shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? The city buzzed with news of the miraculous rescue. Word of Jamal's bravery spread like wildfire, making headlines and dominating conversations. People from every corner of the community marveled at how a young boy from a struggling neighborhood had risked everything to save the children of a man who had built his fortune on exclusion and prejudice. Reporters gathered outside Mr. Whitaker's estate, eager to capture his reaction. Cameras flashed, microphones extended toward him, but for once, the millionaire had nothing to say. He stood by the hospital window, looking down at his twin children as they slept, safe and unharmed, because of the very boy he had once deemed unworthy of respect. His mind swirled with thoughts he had never allowed himself to entertain before. For years, he had dismissed kids like Jamal as troublemakers, products of environments he believed had nothing to offer. Yet, standing in the midst of his luxurious surroundings, he felt something foreign creep into his chest. Humility, shame, gratitude. He had spent his life erecting walls, drawing lines between people based on status and race. Yet here was undeniable proof that goodness knew no boundaries. That evening, in front of a crowd that had gathered outside his home, he took the microphone. His voice, once so authoritative and absolute, wavered. He spoke not as a businessman or a symbol of power, but as a father who had been humbled. He cleared his throat, searching for the right words, but there was no way to soften what needed to be said. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "For years, I built something that divided people. I convinced myself that some were more deserving than others, that opportunity should only belong to a select few. But I was blind. And tonight, a young boy, someone I would have ignored, someone I once judged without knowing, showed me the truth." The crowd murmured in disbelief. This was not the man they had come to know, the man whose wealth had long been used as a barrier rather than a bridge. But he wasn't done. "Because of Jamal," he continued, "I have decided to shut down my private club. It will no longer stand as a place of exclusion. Instead, I am donating the entire property to be turned into a community center, one that will provide education, mentorship, and resources for children just like him." The words sent shockwaves through the city. Reporters scrambled to capture every detail, while those in the crowd exchanged stunned glances. Some cheered, others stood frozen, struggling to process what they had just heard. In his hospital room, Jamal sat on the edge of his chair, listening to the announcement on a small TV screen. He hadn't done any of this for recognition. He had seen 2 children in danger, and did what his heart told him was right. But hearing those words, hearing a man like Whitaker not only admit his wrongs, but take real action, felt like something bigger than a simple act of gratitude. It felt like change. Across the city, the news spread, reaching every home, every corner where people had long believed that things would never shift. The club, once a symbol of exclusivity and division, would now serve as a place for connection, for opportunity, for kids like Jamal who had always been told they didn't belong. And, for the first time in his life, Mr. Whitaker understood that wealth wasn't in what he had built for himself, but in the lives he could help transform. Jamal's life had always been a series of uphill battles, a journey paved with obstacles that seemed impossible to overcome. But for the first time, the world was seeing him not as a struggling boy from the wrong side of town, but as a hero. The fire may have destroyed a building, but it had ignited something far more powerful, a movement toward change. As the days passed, Jamal found himself in places he had never imagined. He was invited to speak at schools, sharing his story with other kids who felt invisible. He met city officials, community leaders, and activists who were inspired by his courage. The boy, who once walked the streets with his head down, was now standing tall, his voice carrying a message of unity and hope. The transformation of Mr. Whitaker's exclusive club into a community center was swift. Construction crews tore down the barriers that once separated people based on race and class, replacing them with open spaces for education, mentorship, and opportunity. Programs were established for underprivileged youth, providing scholarships, career guidance, and support systems that had never existed before. Jamal was given a key role in shaping the center's mission, ensuring that it would be a place where no one felt unwelcome. The change was not just structural, it was personal. Mr. Whitaker, once a man who prided himself on exclusivity, now found himself standing beside Jamal, learning from him, working with him. His transformation was not instant, nor was it easy, years of deeply ingrained prejudice could not be erased overnight. But day by day, conversation by conversation, he started to see the world through a new lens. He no longer viewed success as a privilege reserved for a select few. He saw it as something that should be accessible to all. For Jamal, the shift was even more profound. Opportunities that once seemed like distant dreams were now within reach. He received offers for better schooling, mentorship programs, and financial support that would allow him to build the future he had always hoped for. But despite these new chances, he remained the same boy who had risked everything to save 2 innocent lives. He did not let the attention change him. Instead, he used it to uplift others. The ripple effect of his actions spread far beyond the city. People who had once turned a blind eye to injustice were now inspired to take action. Conversations about race, privilege, and equality became louder and more urgent. The walls that had divided communities for generations were beginning to crumble, replaced by bridges of understanding. Jamal and Mr. Whitaker's unlikely partnership became a symbol of what was possible when people chose empathy over hatred, action over indifference. Their story was a testament to the idea that redemption was always within reach, that no one was beyond change, if they were willing to open their heart. As the years went by, the community center became a thriving hub of progress, a place where young people found mentorship, education, and hope. Mr. Whitaker continued to support it, not as an obligation, but as a true believer in its mission. And at the heart of it all was Jamal, the boy who had once been dismissed, now standing as proof that heroism wasn't defined by wealth or status, but by the willingness to do what was right, no matter the cost. Jamal's journey was far from over, but one thing was certain. His bravery had changed more than just his own life. It had rewritten the story of an entire community, proving that even in the face of prejudice, compassion could prevail. The world would never forget the day a 10-year-old boy ran into the flames, not just to save 2 children, but to spark a change that would last for generations. Jamal's story was not just about a single act of heroism. It was about the power of courage to change the course of lives. In one moment of selflessness, he broke through barriers that had existed for generations, proving that compassion knows no boundaries. His actions shattered stereotypes, forcing a community to look beyond prejudice and see the humanity that unites us all. When Jamal ran into that burning building, he wasn't thinking about race, wealth, or status. He wasn't considering the history of discrimination that had shaped his neighborhood or the deep-seated beliefs of the man whose children he was saving. He was only thinking about doing the right thing. And in that moment, he became more than just a child from a struggling community. He became the embodiment of what true bravery looks like. The fire that threatened to consume lives that day ended up sparking something even more powerful: change. The community center that replaced Mr. Whitaker's exclusive club became a beacon of hope, a place where children of all backgrounds could learn, grow, and dream. The prejudices that had once dictated who was worthy of opportunity began to fade, replaced by a new understanding of what it truly means to be strong, to be kind, and to be human. Mr. Whitaker's transformation was perhaps the most unexpected outcome of all. A man who had spent his life building walls of division now found himself tearing them down, brick by brick. His gratitude toward Jamal evolved into something deeper, a genuine desire to make amends for the past and build a future where no child was ever judged by the color of their skin. He learned that redemption was not about erasing mistakes, but about making the conscious choice to be better. Jamal's journey, however, did not end with recognition or reward. He remained the same humble, determined boy, using his newfound platform to uplift those around him. His story reached beyond his community, inspiring others to question their biases, challenge their assumptions, and take action. It was a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they are simply kids with big hearts and the courage to do what's right. In the end, Jamal's bravery was not just about saving 2 children. It was about proving that kindness is stronger than hatred, that love is more powerful than fear, and that one person, no matter their circumstances, can make a difference. His story teaches us that we all have the ability to create change, to stand up for what is right, and to choose compassion over division. The impact of Jamal's actions will live on, not just in the lives he saved, but in the minds and hearts of everyone who witnessed his courage. He showed the world that heroism is not defined by wealth or privilege, but by the willingness to act when it matters most. And in doing so, he left behind a legacy that will inspire generations to come.